It's Vlogmas Day OTO, so let's talk about role-playing. A few days ago, I took you on a tour of my board game collection, showed you a bunch of different kinds of tabletop games, and talked to you about ones that I like to play and why I like to play them and how they work. But at the end of that video, I said that I hadn't even yet gotten to talk to you about my favorite type of game overall, which is tabletop role-playing games. So that had to be another video, which is this video. We're in it right now. It's happening. I'm talking to you about tabletop role-playing games. Tabletop gaming as a whole is a very rich and diverse hobby. There are all kinds of games out there. It is a deep chasm of geek, ladies and gentlemen, and most of us who are gamers don't cover the whole spectrum, don't play every single kind of game there is imaginable out there. So for example, I showed you my board game collection, which is pretty decent, but by no means represents every style of game that's out there. For example, I don't have very many Euro games. I don't have a lot in the miniature gaming genre. I mean, miniature games and war games is its whole entire subset of games that could take a whole long time to explain what those are about. And half of that hobby is actually about painting miniatures like this one. These are a couple miniatures that I've painted that you take these miniatures which were unpainted when you bought them or even unassembled when you bought them, and you assemble them and you paint them and you make little landscape bases for them to be on. And then you can build armies out of these things and have battles between the armies of the miniatures, and there's all kinds of different systems out there for doing that. Tabletop role-playing is yet another whole genre of games out there in which the players get together and most of the players have a character that they're going to play. The character is a fictional person that they're going to represent in the fictional world of the game, and they're going to make the decisions on behalf of that character, how that character will act and what that character will do. While in a lot of tabletop role-playing games, one player actually is designated as the game master, sometimes called the dungeon master, or narrator, or a few different possible options of titles for this person. But the game master generally is the person who sort of plays the environment and the world and all of the creatures and persons and what we'd call non-player characters that the player characters will interact with. Often the game master is also the person who decides the plot, the storyline behind the game, or the overall theme and direction of the game. And the players then interact, and collectively the whole group ends up telling a story together around the table. A lot of tabletop role-playing games use dice polyhedrals that are multiple-sided, so everyone is familiar with a standard six-sided die, which is the cube dice that's in a lot of different games or that you play craps with. But then there's also four-sided dice, and eight-sided dice, and 10-sided dice, and 12-sided dice, and you can use a pair of 10-siders to represent percentiles, which means it's a range of numbers between 0 and 100. And you can also then have 12 or 20-sided dice, 20-sided die, a dodecahedron. Use that to determine the results in the game, to provide some randomness, to provide some luck, to determine whether a person succeeds or fails at different tasks. The classic example of a role-playing game that most people are familiar with is Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was created by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax together, based off of some systems that they had been playing, which were actually miniature skirmish games. So they were having battles between different miniatures on a board game, on a war game sort of system, just like I described with the miniatures earlier. But they decided that they wanted something more satisfying than individual battles. They wanted to sort of have a whole campaign. They wanted to be able to tell a story over time with these miniatures that they were moving around on the table. And so they decided to focus it down. Instead of each player representing an army, each player would represent one figure, one individual, one person, and that by narrowing it down, then they could have those characters, instead of having one battle or one encounter, they could go on a series of adventures and encounters over time and string those series of adventures together episodically to form an overall story arc, and there you go, you basically have the roots of tabletop role-playing, where the players interact with a game master in order to tell a story collectively around the table. Dungeons & Dragons is the most well-known, in which it's generally a sort of fantasy setting with dwarves and elves and dragons and warriors and wizards and thieves and stuff, and the heroes are generally adventurers, which are people who are going into dungeons, into caverns, into ruined castles and things like that, and they're killing monsters and they're getting treasure and they're gaining experience and they're leveling up and all these things that are sort of classic tropes of role-playing, which have bled over out of tabletop role-playing into video games and even influenced film and novels and other kinds of art forms which have sort of borrowed a lot from tabletop role-playing. But role-playing games are not limited to Dungeons & Dragons. There are games out there that will allow you to play as superheroes, or to role-play in science fiction future scenarios. You can play role-playing games where it's set in space or on other planets. You can play role-playing games where it's a cyberpunk dystopic future. You can play role-playing games that are like horror-themed settings where you're dealing with zombies or mummies or vampires or ghosts or werewolves, or games that are all about like the psychology of people dealing with fear or coping with trauma or tragedy or violence. There are role-playing games out there that will help you tell stories based in mythology, whether it's Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology, or the mythology and stories that come out of indigenous peoples' cultures like Native American culture. There are role-playing games out there for kids designed to be simple to play or to interact with well-known fairy tales like the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. One of my favorite role-playing games out there, Fate, is really good at replicating a sort of pulpy, steampunky action movie vibe. So think like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or Journey to the Center of the Earth, but in a game where the players all get to be the ones creating the story and having the adventure together. I got into role-playing games as a kid because at 8 or 9 years old I discovered my dad's D&D books and a small collection of miniatures that he had, and flipping through them I saw pictures of fantastic beasts and monsters and maps of faraway places and caverns and dark caverns, and I began to imagine what these places were like and what these creatures were like, and I knew that I wanted to imaginatively go and inhabit those places. If you've ever read a novel that was so gripping that the characters seemed so real and the places, though fictional, seemed so real in your mind that you could temporarily, briefly escape your current experience and go and inhabit that other experience, or whether that experience happened for you with a movie or a play or some other art form that enabled you that same sort of escapist experience, then you know the sort of feeling that I'm talking about. Role-playing, without question, takes that experience of traveling to distant, fantastical places much further than any other art form. In a role-playing game, you can not just read about, but actually become that illiterate barbarian who conquers hordes of armies of his enemies. You can become that quick-thinking rogue who talks his way out of every single scrape that he gets into. You can become that never flummoxed detective who always finds the correct answer and unmasks the villain in the nick of time. In role-playing, you can inhabit all of these personas that in other art forms are only there for you to observe. But that's really only the very beginning of why role-playing games are the best of all types of games.